All right, well, welcome back, everyone, to the workshop in the history material text. Now in our 29th year, and actually we are coming up, because I think the seminar started in January of '92. It started mid-year, so we think. So we're coming up on the actual 30th birthday soon. I'm Zach Lesser, professor of English. I'm one of the organizers of the seminar, along with Jerry Singerman, editor emeritus in the Penn Press, John Pollack of the Kislak Center, Eileen Malcolm, the Brisdell Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text. Just a reminder that next week will be entirely virtual for one of our History of Material Text road shows, this one on copy technologies. And these are lightning round talks on objects that are near and dear to the presenters. This one features Jessica Linker of Northeastern, Michelle Warren of Dartmouth, and Brian Cassidy of the Type Punch Matrix booksellers. So you can join us on Zoom in the usual way for that. And again, just if you want to get the Zoom links and you're not on our listserv, you can sign up by going to our website, pennmaterialtext.org, and get on the listserv for our weekly, about twice a week emails. Or you can indicate that you want to be on the listserv on the sign-in sheet that's going around. Please do sign in. It helps us to know who's here, not only for COVID purposes, but regular decanal and provostial purposes. I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Wasserman to the seminar today. Sarah is Associate Professor of English at the University of Delaware, where she's also the Associate Director of the Center for Material Culture Studies. And before joining UD, she was an assistant professor at the JFK Institute of North American Studies in Berlin, and she held a postdoc also at the University of Bonn. So Liliana, I think you can ask your questions in German.
But I can't answer them. Amazing.
So if you go to Sarah's website, you get a great encapsulation of her interests on the splash page. It says, I'm a scholar who specializes in the stuff that surrounds us and what it's doing in 20th and 21st century American literature. And I would like someone to tell me what it's doing in my basement, but that's another topic. So given this interest, it's not surprising that Sarah was a fellow. Some of you may know her from her time here at Penn in 2018-19 at the Wolf Humanities Center Forum on Stuff. After graduating from Kenyon with a BA in both English and biology, Sarah did an MA at Chicago and her PhD at Princeton. Before going into English literature, she worked in material sciences and made prosthetic limbs. So her interests in material culture are deep and varied. Sarah's first monograph is The Death of Things, Ephemera and the American Novel, which came out last year from University of Minnesota Press. Here she examines the role of ephemera, posters, playbills, ticket stubs, stamps, billboards, in the works of writers like Thomas Pynchon, Marilynne Robinson, Don DeLillo, Ralph Ellison, and others. It's already been glowingly reviewed, despite just coming out, called A Phenomenal and Fundamental Book by ASAP Journal. That's ASAP, the Association for the Study of Arts of the Present, which is one of the great acronyms in our field. Incisive and Vivid by The Nation, and a supremely gorgeous account of the stories US novelists tell about the strange life of ephemera in a very long essay in the Ancillary Review of Books. She's also the co-editor of Cultures of Obsolescence, History, Materiality, and the Digital Age, published by Palgrave in 2015, and Model Work, The Material Culture of Making and Knowing, published by Minnesota this year, along with numerous articles in scholarly and public-facing journals, including a piece on Chester Himes and Ralph Ellison that won the 2020 William Riley Parker Prize for the Outstanding Article of the Year in PMLA. I just learned in looking up that prize that the first winner of it was David DeLillo, who was a longtime Penn English, though he wasn't at Penn at the time. Sarah is currently at work on Digital Intimacy, American Love Stories in the Age of the Internet, which argues that the concepts of love and intimacy appear to be undergoing radical transformations due to the innovations of the digital age. I think we'll see some of these interests in ephemera, material and digital culture, and ideas of preservation converge in tonight's talk, so please join me in welcoming Sarah Wasserman.
Wow, thank you so much. That's so much hype. I sort of just want to go home now because I can't possibly live up to that. But can everyone at home on Zoom hear me? So can someone give a thumbs up? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks so much. Zach, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. John, I'm going to mention you again later, but thank you for pulling the ephemera that you see in front of you on the tables today. And thanks to Eileen for your organizational support. So I also want to thank all of you, both here in person and here on Zoom, for being here as we crawl our way to Thanksgiving break and the end of the semester. I know everyone is really exhausted and zoomed out. So I'm deeply grateful that you've made time and energy for the day. And in return, instead of giving a talk, we're going to do a guided nap. No, I'm kidding. But I am going to try to not be boring. That seems like the least I can do for all of you here today, giving your time so generously. So before I begin, a couple more thanks. So thanks to the material texts community in general for being so welcoming and inclusive over the years. And I also want to thank Whitney Tratine who's been really a fellow traveler on the road of first books and also on the more uncertain path of how the study of materiality might be invigorated by feminist thought and by digital theories and practices. So I'm very excited to be here in person, and I'm grateful for the chance to talk to an audience that collectively knows so much about my topic and knows about it from different periods and angles than the ones I work in. So many people in this group have done work on textual materiality and ephemera that has made my own work possible. And I hope that in my presentation today, you'll recognize those influences. So before I begin, and I'll cue up my PowerPoint now. Let's see if I can manage to do this successfully. So before I begin, I want to stress that while I have done a fair amount of work with ephemeral objects, what primarily interests me is not the objects themselves, but their representation in post-45 US literature. This is to say, I make no claim, actually, at being an expert on ephemera. For that, you should talk to Mitch Frost, who I don't think is here today, but
he says hi and he's home.
Good. Hi, Mitch on the replay, I guess. So I'm rather a literary scholar interested in why so many of the most celebrated American novelists give us detailed, extensive portraits of this special class of objects. In The Death of Things, Ephemera in the American Novel, I look, as Zach said, at representations of many different objects, including pop-up buildings, postage stamps, ticket stubs, billboards, pamphlets, and so on. Today, I'll discuss what we might paradoxically call a monumental instance of ephemera, the 1939 New York World's Fair, and the way it appears in novels by E.L. Doctorow and Michael Chabon that explicitly address its transience. Later, I'll consider the impact that contemporary digital practices that I suspect many of you here, especially the librarians and archivists, know more about than I do. The impact that these practices have on the afterlife of the World's Fair and its many objects. As literary and material culture scholars respond to digitization and a range of web-based innovations, the central dynamics of ephemera are shifting and taking on new urgency. In my current research on digital media, online behavior, and intimacy, I'm interested in how both preservation and transience, materiality and immateriality exist in strange ratios that alter our perceptions and our emotions. So today, I'll take the 1939 New York World's Fair, its representation in contemporary fiction, and its recent appearance in digital forms in one analytic arc. This line from reality to fiction and across media illuminates how objects continue to impress themselves on our cultural imagination, even as they vanish, or in fact, especially because they are vanishing. So The Death of Things considers representations of ephemera, objects marked by their imminent disappearance or destruction in a number of post-45 US novels. Why does this sort of object appear so often in major works of American literature? Of course, fiction has always cataloged the objects that populate our world, but modern novels frequently depict the decay and disappearance of objects, leaving us a literary history that has gone largely unchronicled. I track the material changes that took place over the 20th century, including planned obsolescence, deindustrialization, and the shift from print to digital media, to show how these changes have made the ephemeral object ever more meaningful in American fiction. At the outset, I want to note that I don't think the vanishing object is simply a cipher for a disappearing way of life that is meant to be mourned. Although at times post-45 literature responds to the vanishing object world in ways that are melancholic, it does so just as often in ways that are generative and transformative. In the book, as I noted in the abstract, I look at portraits of ephemera in novels by writers like Ralph Ellison, Philip K. Dick, Thomas Pynchon, Marilynne Robinson, and Don DeLillo. These writers do sometimes use ephemera to elegize the waning promises of American modernity, those shiny narratives spun after the Second World War about exceptionalism and the bright future it would bring. But they also consider the excessive and sometimes exuberant character of ephemera. They know that we love this kind of object, and they use these objects to pleasurable effect, to depict new uses of urban space, new forms of community, new visibility for marginalized groups, and new conceptions of the marginal itself. In each chapter of The Death of Things, I begin by situating particular ephemeral objects like these in context through historical and archival research. I then turn to representations of these objects in literary texts, exploring the ways that even as they vanish, ephemera exert great power on characters, readers, and aesthetic forms. Scholarship on disappearance and on ephemera is hardly new. So before I turn to my examples for today, I want to describe just briefly how my method differs from conventional material culture studies and from thing theory or the new materialisms. My aim in the book is really to develop and test out a method that gives us new ways to read the objects in and of American literature. On the most basic level, my relation to material culture studies has always been shaped by my grounding in literature. At the core of my training, my teaching, and my research is an interpretive investment in the text part of material texts. So while the book, and also my job at UD and its affiliate museums at Winterthur and the Hagley, although they're rooted in the traditions and methods of material culture studies, those methods actually felt rather inadequate for making sense of objects when they are not there or less there over time. I wanted a theory to explain the work that disappearing objects do in fiction, their oscillation between present and absent, their ability to conjure up the mutability of our physical world and the transience of our lives. I was looking for ways to understand what I call the peculiar durée of ephemera and the fact that novels portray not only the objects, but also their loss and vanishing. The book's title, as I believe Paul Saint-Amour, among others, has pointed out, might therefore be something of a misnomer, since ephemera, as they are stored within the container of the novel, are neither quite lost nor quite present. Neither dead or alive, they are instead always dying, coming to us in an ongoing state of ceasing to be. I don't think that the novels I examine depict these ephemera in order to grant them animacy or describe a post-human world populated by agentic objects. The novels that interest me use ephemera to make visible the many ways in which the vanishing object constitutes the enduring subject. The project then sits uneasily amidst the majority of recent object-based studies, which are rather enamored with the object's potential to usher in what new materialists, drawing on Deleuze, call a flat ontology, a decentering of the human that promises to be both ethical and ecological. It feels to me that this position is something of an overcorrection against the universalizing discourses of the subject, that in an effort to turn away from all the harms that the humanist tradition has done, critics turned to objects and then, ironically, elevated them to the position of subjects. Paradoxical as it may seem, psychoanalytic theory has helped explain all of this to me, and I would argue it has always superannuated thing theory. Because psychoanalysis has long made subjects of objects and vice versa, it puts pressure on contemporary theories of agentic objects. Very quickly, I'll just share a central psychoanalytic insight that has structured my thinking about ephemera. In a relatively little-known essay by Freud from 1915 on transience, Freud offers a curious definition of what he calls transience value. And the publication and material history of this essay is actually really fascinating, as Priya, who's here, knows from a panel we did a while back. And if anyone wants to know more about the material history behind the publication of this, we can talk about that in the Q&A. But for now, I just want to share this quote. In the essay, Freud writes, "Transience value is scarcity value in time. Limitation in the possibility of an enjoyment raises the value of the enjoyment." So this is really familiar logic, right? We know this from pop-up shops or limited time only items, or like pumpkin spice lattes before they were available from August until Christmas. According to this formulation, we should enjoy rather than lament the things that we know cannot last. This is easier said than done. Freud himself struggles to take pleasure in transience, and by the end of the essay, his claims collapse under the weight of his own grief. Freud wants to claim enjoyment, but it disappears as he grasps it, like the things he mourns. A similar duality occurs in novels about disappearing objects, though often in reverse. The short lives of consumer goods, the mutability of cityscapes, the loss and destruction of prized objects, they don't simply inspire grief in these fictions. They do that, but they also give rise to historical awareness, practices of resistance, and to non-dominative ways of being in the world. The Freudian ambivalence that I see in literary portraits of vanishing stuff shows us that as hard as we find it to let go of our belongings, we can never fully possess them either. We project onto objects because we hope to find in them something less fragile and more durable than ourselves. But objects, like humans, are transient, some more so, others less, and many lasting only because of the care of a curator or an archivist. The point is that since the object is never entirely dead nor wholly alive, our projections do not always serve us well. Post-45 American novelists point this out frequently. They record the lost objects of the 20th century and record not only their existence, but also their loss. Their fictions give us a powerful way to navigate between what I see as the antiquarian impulses of material culture studies and the agentic impulses of the new materialisms. My goal then is not to discard material culture studies or thing theory altogether, but to draw upon their insights in order to build them out toward a more robustly literary historical method and toward contemporary concerns about temporality, scale, and environment. In my work, literary treatments of objects, quite often real historical objects like you're looking at on the table, reveal histories and forces of production, consumption, circulation, and disposal that can otherwise be hard to apprehend. A very simple way to put this that hinges on a false binary but is nonetheless useful is that in the novels that interest me, disappearance often conveys feelings, longings, and affects, while materiality conveys history. Okay, but enough about all these abstract ideas. Let's talk about some stuff. So the 1939 New York World's Fair, which many of you probably know in some capacity, either you had a family member who attended, or you read about it, or you've seen things about it. I mean, it's a very sort of popular instance of mass popular culture, even today. And it was really a container of objects and a sort of mega object itself. It was a prosthetic city that aggregates past and present into a fantastical urban future. So as I'll argue, Dr. O's World's Fair, which is a novel from 1985 and was winner of the National Book Award, and Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which came out in 2000 and won the Pulitzer Prize. Both of these novels look back at the fair and its ephemerality to challenge its fantasies and our nostalgia for them. So it struck me when I was working on this that the novels about the fair felt both celebratory and melancholic. And I realized that to understand how they were working with nostalgia and futurity, I would need to get a handle on how the fair itself was doing that at the time. So researching the material history of the fair helped me to see how its future visions were constructed. And only then could I really understand how the novels were actually using the disappearance of objects to think about the fair's future as something that was mourned at the very moment that it was put on display. The novels are really looking, obviously, from the time they're published, they're looking back to the fair, but they're doing that to emphasize transience. And that's really hard, actually, to capture in an exhibit or an archive, which is what I'm going to talk about when we talk about the digital modes of archiving this. But the novels are really critiquing, from a distinctly Jewish American perspective, the fair's nationalist narratives of progress. So as for fairs in general, there's plenty to say. We could be here all night and all semester, but just very briefly, to go back a bit, in 1896, Georg Simmel wrote a review of a grand trade show in Berlin. And Simmel wrote that the trade show could only be understood in the broader context of the fin de siècle expositions that had been taking place throughout Europe. He argued that these expositions were, quote, momentary centers of world civilization, which assembled the products of the entire world in a confined space as if in a single picture, end quote. Zimmel diagnosed the fairs, intended for temporary use only, as essential features of modernity, sites that revealed urban space and visualized consumer culture as condition and consequence of late 19th century globalizing processes. But universal expositions, once spectacles that have riveted the world's attention, have now nearly vanished altogether. It's true we have theme parks and, I don't know, flower shows and Disney World, and we have some offshoots, but fairs as they were are basically over. The last one to be held in the United States was the 1984 Louisiana Exposition, which was so poorly attended that it earned the dubious distinction of being the only World's Fair to declare bankruptcy during its run. But the funny thing is that no matter how passé these fairs are, they continue to capture the imagination, making their way into novels, films, and scholarly texts. And if you start looking for World's Fairs, they're like everywhere. I mean, they're in Iron Man, they're in popular novels, they crop up everywhere still to this day. And in the field of material culture studies, World's Fair occupy a very prominent place. They came into focus as an object of study at the same time that scholars such as Arjuna Pajrai and Daniel Miller were developing theories that remain central to the study of objects. Seminal work from the 80s and 90s by Tony Bennett, Timothy Mitchell, and Robert Rydell argued that World's Fairs did important cultural and political work, consolidating national narratives and imperialist ideas. Despite all of this work on fairs, there's little consensus as to whether exhibitions had a homeopathic relationship to modernity or an allopathic one. Did fairs educate visitors about modernity or simply thrill and overwhelm them? In considering this, few scholars have mentioned one significant condition of that modernity, that it was not only excessive and taxing to the senses, but that it bred practices, structures, and goods that became increasingly ephemeral under industrial capitalism. And this fact is central to the logic of World's Fairs. Although they provided seductive glimpses of an imaginary world that seemed close at hand, it was clear from the outset that the fair's grand structures and endless displays would be dismantled, that the expositions were always, as Burton Benedict describes, rituals of abundance ending in property destruction. In this respect, the very transience of the fairs reflected the nature of the commodities they showcased, especially in their temporary novelty and the rapidity of their worldwide circulation. Scholars most often examine the object lessons that fairs offered visitors. This focus on the fair's pedagogic dimensions and the history of its commodities has obscured the final chapter in those histories. The fair's transience, though, is no trivial fact. It lent expositions their near mythic status and appeal, but it also prompted, at the time of the fairs and in retrospect, grief for the utopian visions that would be inevitably demolished. I love the fact that almost every World's Fair generated debates among its creators and architects about what should become of the structures and displays once the fair ended. So one of the Chicago Columbian Exposition's architects, Charles McKim, wrote to a friend in 1893, for instance, that he felt the fair, quote, should be swept away in the same magical manner in which it appeared. The most glorious way would be to blow up the buildings with dynamite or to destroy them with fire. This would be the easiest and grandest spectacle, except for the danger of flying embers in the event of a change of wind from the lake. So this talk of conflagration speaks to the despair that many felt in watching the dreams staged by fairs come to their end. In the 1939 New York World's Fair, shimmering like a mirage in the oasis between the Great Depression and the Second World War, that despair encroached on the fairgrounds even before the gates had closed. During the 4 years it took to develop the New York World's Fair, its planners settled on the thematic slogan, "Building the World of Tomorrow." And they worked to erect this world on the site of a former garbage dump in Queens. It's actually the same grim location described by F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby as a valley of ashes. Spreading outward from the iconic futuristic theme buildings, which you see here, the unmistakably intentionally white conic trilon and the globe-shaped perisphere were a profusion of exhibits that offered previews of how the fair's engineers and its corporate sponsors imagined the coming decades in the 20th century. The architects, including Norman Bell Geddes and Raymond Loewy, used the stream form style throughout. Structures were smoothed down into seamless and aerodynamic shapes resembling airplanes. And inside these streamform structures, landscapes lifted from science fiction came to life. The America on display there featured rocket ports, radio-controlled superhighways, electrified farms, and my favorite, cigarette-smoking robots. As if to confirm the world of tomorrow's relation to science fiction, H.G. Wells actually weighed in on the fair in a special March issue of the New York Times. He wrote that the visitor to the fair must let his imagination off the leash, and then he may really get a glimpse of the realities of tomorrow that lurk in this jungle of exhibits. It will cease to look like a collection of things for sale and reveal its real meaning as a gathering of live objects, each of which is going to do something to him, possibly quite startling, before he is much older. Wells's instruction to the fairgoer are certainly strange, both enthusiastic and menacing. Lurking in a jungle of exhibits, the fair's objects come alive, transformed into energetic artifacts, preparing to act upon the men, women, and children who have come to gaze upon them. Calling the fair a gathering of live objects, Wells allows us to think about what may in fact be their most startling behavior, that the objects themselves will not have the chance to grow older, that they will perish before their promises are fulfilled. But this is not to say that these fleeting objects do not do something to the fair's visitor. It is rather to insist that their real meaning is constituted as much by their projected absence as by their sensational presence. How, though, can one actually read a World's Fair, not only for its excesses, but also for its disappearance? And this is where actually having this material in front of you that John pulled for us, I brought my one tiny little piece of World's Fair ephemera, which is this great souvenir booklet where I love that it's called Seeing New York World's Fair in Colors. And then of course, all the photography is black and white. But you know, they give you some color drawings, I guess, on the outside. So that's how they get away with that. But so the question is, you know, how do we read for disappearance and not just all this proliferation, this excess? And I think that archives and these kinds of objects in front of us give us a great glimpse of the buildings and the exhibits of the world of tomorrow. And also newspaper articles, guidebooks, and letters can testify to the importance of the fair's transience. But it still always, for me, remains difficult to access that which cannot be archived in the conventional sense, the meaning made by the fair's transient nature. But Dr. O and Chabin do just this. They spill ink to depict how the fair's objects fade into ruin and dissolve into debris. And I'm not going to spend too long talking about these novels, but I am just going to run through a couple quick examples to give you a sense of how this works before turning to the digital practices. So let me begin then with Dr. O. So the plot of Dr. O's World's Fair is fairly simple. The first person narrator, who is a child that shares who shares the author's first name, Edgar, lives with his parents and brother, who also share the names of Dr. O's real family. And he is looking back on his 1930s childhood in the Bronx. The book opens in the early 30s during the Depression, and it ends at the fair in Flushing Meadows. Edgar recollects his boyhood, and the story moves forward through time, stopping along the way to offer up vivid details of Jewish life in the Bronx during the Depression. A visit to a kosher butcher, the decline of Edgar's Yiddish-speaking grandmother into senility, and the disappointment of a very austere Hanukkah. The fair of the novel's title looms throughout, beckoning Edgar and his family with its amazing vision of American automation and prosperity. But it announces itself to Edgar on a much smaller scale, in a parade of small objects that proliferate like tokens of life on a different planet. At his father's music store near Radio City Music Hall, Edgar notes the fair's growing material presence. A neighboring shop sells World's Fair kazoos, ocarinas, pins, and banners like these. The proliferation of souvenirs such as these, even miles away from Flushing Meadows, heightens Edgar's concern that he will miss the fair, that before he arrives at the world of tomorrow, it will already be a thing of the past. His family has fallen into financial trouble, and Edgar worries that his parents will not be able to afford to take him to the fair. Eventually, Edgar does make it to the fair with his friend Meg, whose mother works in the fair's amusement zone, performing in an aquatic peep show with Oscar the amorous octopus. And lest you think this is just Doctorow, this is based on a real show at the fair, which was designed by Salvador Dali, called Dali's Dream of Venus. He had some kind of hand in planning this, it's very unclear. But when Edgar arrives at Flushing Meadows, he is initially awed by the fair's awesome proportions. Like, he doesn't know where to go, where to begin, what to do. But he quickly comes to think of the structures, especially the Trilon and Perisphere, as friends of his that make him incredibly happy. The way that Edgar navigates the fair by collapsing its expanses into a more manageable scale is important. It will not only link Doctorow's novel to Chabon's, but it also works to reduce the fair from the monumental to the mundane, the projected future to the recent past. For example, he describes the General Motors Pavilion, and this is one of these streamform buildings. He says, it's a great streamlined building of rounded corners and windowless walls, and it looked like the kind of structure I would make by turning over a pail of wet sand at the beach and pounding the bottom of the pail and lifting it off the sand mold. This association transforms the streamform architecture from an emblem of modernity to the ephemeral handicraft of a child at the beach. Likewise, when Edgar sees the Futurama exhibit, and this is the photo that we used to advertise the talk of people in their revolving chairs looking down at the model city that was inside Futurama. When Edgar looks at it, he says that looking at the miniature world with its small moving parts, all the lights and shadows, the animation is like looking at the largest, most complicated toy ever made. The cars in Futurama remind Edgar of his toy cars, the little sedans of gunmetal whose wheels spun on axles no thicker than a needle as I drove them along the colored tracks of my plaid carriage blanket. Edgar's comparison has a curious effect. Rather than moving forward into the exhibit's near future world of gleaming spires and high-speed motorways, Edgar regresses into nostalgic reverie. The future furnished by this miniature world becomes a wellspring of Edgar's past. Navigating the fair this way, attending closely to its many objects, the novel suggests that the appeal of the future may come in no small part from its ability to play on idyllic memories. This temporal conjunction is especially important to Edgar because as a Jewish boy in 1939 America, he cannot so readily accept the fair's rosy vision of the future. It's during his second visit to the fair that the attention Edgar has paid to its sets and surfaces reveals the world of tomorrow as already fading and obsolete. I could see everywhere signs of decay, he notes, and describes this decay in detail. This portrait of the fair's fading splendor gives us a strong impression of an innovative world picture passing into ruin. The scene also gestures to the historical events unfolding beyond New York. Here at the end of the novel, in the fair's final days of September 1940, World War II has left its mark on Flushing Meadows. In Doctorow's novel, the painful contrast between the world of tomorrow and the world of 1940 is immediately and intimately connected with Edgar's Jewishness. His mother, Rose, wants to see the Jewish Palestine Pavilion because she says it shows that Jews can be like everyone else. Edgar's father visits the pavilions of the Netherlands and Czechoslovakia in order to pay his respects to these nations now lost. The fleeting objects become, at this moment in the novel, historical ciphers. The intrusion of the war into the dream world of the fair connects Ephemera to the tremendous losses beyond Edgar's immediate view. Doctorow's novel reveals that the fair's futurity is intimately bound up with nostalgia, but the incursion of the war in the novel also allows us to see the dark historical horizon to which the fair's objects point. So if you remember, the novel is published in 1985, when the Reagan administration's Cold War Strategic Defense Initiative system, derided by the mainstream media for its unrealistic aims as Star Wars, mobilized science fictional tropes for militaristic aims. So it's not difficult to imagine why World's Fair would catalog not only the disappearance of the American radical past, as Frederick Jameson has called Doctorow's theme, but also the future visions that might have been once thought to sustain it. I don't want to get too into the weeds of the novel, but it's worth noting that in the final scene of the novel, Doctorow depicts Edgar appropriating one of the fair's own strategies of preservation. Just as the fair closes its gates for good, Edgar goes to Claremont Park to bury his own time capsule, constructed from aluminum foil and a cardboard mailing tube. So the original capsule, the official capsule, to be opened in the wildly distant year of 6939, included or includes, I'm never sure which tense to talk about this in, It included, among other things, a US silver dollar, a Sears Roebuck catalog, a pack of Camel cigarettes, lots of microfilm, and elaborate plans to help finders from the future understand what these objects even were. Edgar's tube, on the other hand, contains a broken Tom Mix decoder badge, a toy rocket ship with worn paint, and a torn silk stocking of his mother's as a sample textile. The Westinghouse time capsule celebrates the present, right? You know, we're in this American present, there's this plenitude, there's innovation, and it also at the same time posits a future so advanced that its people would view the contents as antiquated relics from a bygone era. Edgar's capsule, on the other hand, contains what is clearly meant to be the debris of his childhood. The context of an emerging American future for Edgar and the fragile, potentially even residual nature of Jewish life in Europe prompts me to briefly remark on some of the most fascinating but overlooked objects actually included in this Westinghouse capsule. The time capsule's book of record, transferred onto microfilm, contains written messages from 3 important men of the time. 2 of these 3 were Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann, who by then had both fled Germany for the United States. The remarkable messages by Einstein and Mann attest to the dissonance between the fair's future visions and the actual conditions of global politics at the time. Einstein's message explicitly links the material practices celebrated by the fair with the brutality of war. He wrote for the time capsule, the production and distribution of commodities is entirely unorganized so that everybody must live in fear of being eliminated from the economic cycle, in this way suffering for the want of everything. Furthermore, people living in different countries kill each other at irregular time intervals, so that also for this reason, anyone who thinks about the future must live in fear and terror. The evocation of wartime grief in Einstein and Mann's messages is especially pertinent to the fair's final moments. On October 27th, 1940, at the fair's closing ceremony, a lone trumpeter stood atop the helicline, which was the elevated walkway between the Trilon and the Perisphere, and played taps. So they had a kind of funeral service for the fair on its closing day. The military dirge marked the end of the fair, but also its reincarnation. The Trilon and Perisphere, stripped of their gypsum surfaces, were turned into 40,000 tons of steel that went into ships, shell casings, and gun forgings for the American war effort. This, we might say, is the true afterlife of the fair, one that becomes visible when we attend to its transience. This fact is central to Chabon's amazing adventures of Cavalier and Clay. The novel follows the lives of 2 Jewish cousins before, during, and after World War II. Joseph Cavalier, a Czech artist, flees to New York where he teams up with Brooklyn-born writer Sam Clayman. In the novel, the 2 cousins become major figures in the comics industry with their creation of an anti-fascist superhero called the Escapist. And the novel's narrator says directly that the fair was a way for Americans to forget about the war, that it continues, quote, while the rest of the world was busy feeding itself country by country to the furnace. In an especially poignant scene, the only one I'll talk about, Sam Clay articulates what Edgar could only express obliquely, that despite its best attempts at making the world of tomorrow a present day reality, the fair was never more than a mirage made material. Sneaking over the high fence around the fairgrounds just after the exposition has ended, Sam Clay discovers a specter of the better world in which he had once believed. And this is just one piece of a very long, stunning passage. But you can see here, Chabon writes, it made Sam's heart ache to look around the vast expanse of the fairground that not very long ago had swarmed with flags and women's hats and people being whizzed about in jitneys. And he goes on and names all these things. The statues of George Washington and freedom of speech and truth showing the way to freedom had been peeled, stripped, prized apart, knocked down, bulldozed into piles, loaded onto truck beds, dumped into barges, towed out past the mouth of the harbor and sent to the bottom of the sea. Like the images from the end of Dr. O's novel, the set of ruins confirms the end of Sam's youth and exposes the fair's untenable promises. As Sam stands in the center of the abandoned Futurama exhibit and occasionally, despite his caution, steps upon a model building, we see the fair's dreams crushed under the weight of history. So if the fair is meant to screen out the history that motivates Chabon's entire plot, that is war, genocide, immigration, and ethnic outsiderism, the novel's characters, because they are Jewish, understand the fair as presenting an American mythology that tries to wish away the damage of history with the promises of Tomorrowland. If the ephemeral object usually has an obscure, unseen afterlife, Dr. Owen Chabin put it on display and followed transient objects to their makeshift graves in the park and at the bottom of the sea. It would be wrong to conclude that this move is strictly nostalgic, inviting us to reminisce about the days of the fair and mourn its passing. Writing from that explicitly Jewish American perspective, Dr. O and Chabin do more than lyricize the ordinary management, if you will, of time passing. The novel's attention to ephemera instead acknowledges how the fair's dreams of a future recede into the past as they were set forth. So rather than a romance about a lost way of life then, which is how these novels often both get read, they really help us feel the anxiety that adheres to a future vision that proves obsolete from the beginning. What this reading of World's Fairs suggests is that fascination with the future can often obscure the forms of history and nostalgia that inhere in the new. As a side point, as critics, especially in contemporary literature, hailed the arrival of a new period, and one that feels increasingly immaterial, perhaps, vanishing objects and the texts in which they appear can help us make sense of this new period, I would say. They give us an important prehistory rooted in the material conditions of American modernity. So to illustrate more concretely that last point, to demonstrate how research in material culture studies and on ephemera and on the history of fairs and exhibitions, to illustrate how I think that's extremely relevant right now in this digital moment, I guess if we want to call it that, I'm going to spend my remaining time looking at one final example. And I'm curious if any of you are familiar with this example, but okay. In May 2011, the New York Public Library released its first iPad app, designed to appeal to a new tech-savvy audience. So created by the Potion Design Studio, the app goes by the name of Biblion, the Boundless Library. The first release in what was supposed to be a series of the Boundless Library was the World's Fair app, an interactive trove of over 700 items from the library's 1939 to 1940 New York World's Fair collection. So I'm going to show you the first minute of a video that the library made with Potion Design to announce the app's release. So hopefully this is going to work, sound and all.
What if you could hold in your hands countless one-of-a-kind treasures held within the legendary stacks of the New York Public Library? What if you could turn over, zoom in, flip through, and explore more than 700 items and even access rare film and sound archives? Biblion, the Boundless Library, lets you do all this within a charted world or infoscape of the vast collections of the library, the stacks. This launch edition showcases one of the largest and most used collections, the 1939-40 World's Fair, the World of Tomorrow, contained here in 2,500 boxes. New visual pathways into the stacks now lead to infinite narratives and unexpected connections. An exhibition wall is your entry point into storylines that emerge when original sources are given shape. Now you can see how the World's Fair, like the library, has something for everyone. You'll find a world dealing with economic crises and war, to starlets, to pop culture, and technological innovation. So enter the world of tomorrow and see a real visualization of the items that make up stories, ranging from text-based essays to galleries.
Okay, whew, lots to say there. So I'd like to draw your attention to some of the rhetorical moves made here. The video makes a promise that app users will have an experience exactly like that of being in the stacks, inviting you to hold in your hand the one-of-a-kind treasures from the library's collection, offering you, my favorite, a real visualization of the items, and promising a guided tour through the stacks. But at the same time, the video also promises a brand new experience, one so new that it can only be described with new words. By entering the infoscape, you will discover new visual pathways that now lead to infinite narratives and unexpected interstory connections through a process that the video says you might call multilinear reading. Yoking printed media to digital forms, literary narratives to visual links, Biblion promises to give users the real artifact and something more, a boundless library that preserves materials and joins them together in dazzling networks. That the library's first foray into the realm of apps centers on the 1939 fair is no coincidence. There are practical reasons for this choice, of course. The archive is large but well organized, it's reasonably popular, and it's all about New York. But more than this, as a topic, the fair speaks to both aims of the app, to grant access to archival materials and to expand the shape of the archive itself. The library mobilizes the fair's own blend of nostalgia and futurity to give the app its appeal. We are offered a look at the past, the fashion, the architecture, the food, but also the past of our media history, handwritten letters, telegrams, and typewritten documents. At the same time, the dynamic visuals of touchscreen technology and three-dimensional graphics are meant to awe us. In this narrative, the Trilon and Perisphere culminate not in metal for bullets, but in the pristine surface of an Apple tablet. The video ends with an invitation to enter the world of tomorrow, as if the iPad is not a device allowing us to swipe through a curated digital exhibit, but a portal leading directly into the future past. Although the app won several awards, including Apple's Education App of the Year in 2011, and it was written about in glowing terms. So The Atlantic published a story about the app with the headline, "Did the New York Public Library just build the magazine app of the future?" There was a lot of buzz around this, but it fizzled out pretty unceremoniously. So none of the promised future installments have been released. And since 2015, the webpage for the app has been listed as archived, of course. We can chalk Biblion's ultimate failure up to many things: a misunderstanding about the kind of technology that library patrons want to use, a platform that for all its supposed dynamism lacks the interaction that is the hallmark of social media, the simple fact that someone might want to use this app once, but not repeatedly, and therefore not enough to download it. But of course, I would say that the app's limitations are also related to its attempt to preserve everything about the fair except one of the things that made it so appealing: its transience. In conclusion, I'd like to point out that the Biblion app raises a central question facing many scholars today, especially those of us who are trying to manage archives that are more available digitally, but can therefore seem increasingly ephemeral. Whenever I talk about my work, I'm inevitably asked, isn't the internet making books themselves ephemeral? If you do literature today, that's, and you talk about ephemera, you get asked that question. And as this group knows better than any other, the physical book has always existed in a multitude of forms. Johanna Drucker, Andrew Piper, Jessica Pressman, and Leah Price are just a few of the scholars who argue that the continuity between the printed text and its newer iterations suggests that digitization will not kill the book, but allow it instead to multiply and proliferate. With this in mind, it strikes me that the question is less whether the book is ephemeral or dying, and more whether or not the concept of ephemera is dying, thanks to increasing storage capacity and decreasing storage costs. The internet seems poised to preserve all ephemera long past their natural lives. In this era of expanding hard drives, tweet archives, and the proliferation of cloud computing, it's as if certain forms of loss themselves are obsolete. The story of Biblion shows us, though, how even if that's possible, it may not always be desirable. One lesson of ephemerality, and you can think back here to Edgar's time capsule, is that fictions of preservation have long underwritten our ideas of loss. In other words, loss as a concept depends upon the desire for things to endure. This is a dialectic that remains hidden, but is painfully obvious the minute you say it. The fantasy of prosthetic memory and infinite storage aren't just technological dreams. They're intimate counterparts to the losses we experience every day. The tools we create for preserving ephemera, from the physical archive to the digital infoscape, are therefore intimately related to the grief and anxiety that literature about ephemera can capture. I'm preaching to the choir, of course, but we need literature to reveal the deep ambivalences of our relations to things. The novels I've taken as examples today, like the app, recreate the fair in vivid detail, but they do so with a crucial difference. Insisting on the ephemeral, they help us see the fair's legacy as one not only of material or narrative presence, but absence. Literature, then, it bears repeating, is a special kind of archive we can turn to even as the archive shifts or vanishes around us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The floor is open. If you're on Zoom and you have we should close that chat. For now. If you're on Zoom and you have a question, use the raise hand function and we will call on you and you can ask your question live. But Juliana, start us off.
Thank you so much. After the introduction, I feel called upon. Sarah, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I was struck that you cited Freud's essay on transience and not Freud's book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which I think is very crucial for the 39 words sphere. Because what you showed in some ways is that not transience is the issue here, but the illusion of it, and how something that could give enjoyment in the context of the fear becomes very poignantly the opposite if you don't talk about disappearing texts or objects, but disappearing bodies in the war. And that kind of connection is with the word fair very early on. Think about the early Paris word fair that was not only there to show modernity, but also to undo the loss of the 1871 war. So the question of war and fair, world fair, and bodies and objects cannot be undone. And I almost feel that there is a real story that is much more poignant than either novel that you cited. Let me go to the Philadelphia World Fair. And there's a World Fair building that is still standing, the former Peace Touch Museum, kind of standing. That was the model for the German building, the German Reichstag. The German political Reichstag was built on the model of the Philadelphia World Fair. Wow. Now that had a fire in 1933 in January that brought Hitler to power. So the kind of disappearance and fire has been played out in real life in a way that these novels can't capture.
Thanks so much. I'm not sure if there's a question there other than that you're making an argument that is really important, right? That is to say war and the fair as a kind of staging of plenitude that then becomes its opposite is really central to the text I'm looking at. And that's not to say these are the only texts that do that or that it begins in 1945 or something like that. So, and I would just say that, of course, in addition, in addition to the Philadelphia example, there are so many examples of, let's just say, architecture that remains, that then, structures a city, structures also not just wartime politics that are problematic, but contemporary urban planning politics, displacement, segregation, that there are all these legacies that you're talking about when you say bodies and objects that come straight out of the fair too, right? And
I just want to push two words, transience and illusion.
Transience and what's the second? Illusion.
That it becomes all real if the new body is building goes up in fire with tremendous consequences. And it becomes, in terms of illusion, and in terms of transience, it doesn't really go away on many levels, and not just the literary.
And that's actually where Freud is useful to me, when he's talking about Hinfälligkeit. It's not that transience is just disappearance. And I'm trying to actually articulate that as these authors are articulating that as well. That, of course, one of the central points about ephemera, whether we hold it in our hand or we're talking about these architectural buildings, is it might be designed to disappear or to be destroyed, but something remains with us. And I think literature, as I'm arguing in this particular case, is a certain kind of container for what remains. But I would actually be interested also to think about via Freud, as I do, and in the book, of course, it's not just this essay, but thinking about pleasure principle, thinking about also other psychoanalytic narratives of objects. Transience and illusion, I think in what you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is they're not opposite either. I mean, you're saying there are these two terms. And in fact, what psychoanalytic literature, and in particular that Freud essay that I like so much, is helpful to me because it is actually showing that the very idea of transience hinges on an illusion that we might possess something fully or that it might fully disappear. And where I take your comment to be incredibly interesting too, is the fairs, as you're talking about, the long legacy of the fairs in disciplining bodies that so many other scholars have written about when they talk about the Midway Plaisance, when they talk about ethnographic exhibits and the way that they display the body, is of course that I think it's really important to think about the illusion, if you want to use that word, that's dependent on the staging of those bodies, and that it's obdurate. I mean, that it's not something that then just disappears. And there's so much scholarship out there on that. That's fascinating, but it's not, I think, a part of these novels that I'm talking about, but you're absolutely right to point it out.
Can I follow up on, I think that's fascinating, because I was thinking about, the Centennial Exposition here, and the fact that a lot of those buildings were put together with the idea that they would be taken down and the materials reused. But thinking about buildings from all these fairs,
Yeah.
and the ways in which they create that illusion of a kind of permanence, and then when you start to look closely, it's really, it is an illusion, and this is, these are like stage sets. And so thinking about that whole piece of it, I think it's really important.
I think it is too. And in the book, I do a lot with urban studies and cityscapes, which are themselves, not staged in this way, but then come to share certain characteristics of ephemerality in the literature that interests me. But I do think I got really interested, and that's probably as much from my material science background as anything else, but the idea of the prosthetic city. So that what becomes the illusion is the all-inclusive environment, but then it does get pieced apart. We have buildings in Philadelphia and buildings in Chicago and Ferris wheels and Seattle sky needles and all of these pieces that have been pulled out of their kind of in situ ecology that was meant to be immersive. And they do very different work then as a remainder, so that this transience or the ephemerality of the fair is still a different character than a precise building lasting or not, if that makes sense.
I mean, that does make sense. It's thinking about what it's trying to do, but also the modes in which it does that.
And the moments in which it fails, right? I mean, it's part of what you're pointing out.
JC, do you want to unmute
Oh, yeah.
and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Can you hear me? Hi, Sarah.
Hi, JC.
Thanks so much for, this great talk. This is really fascinating. I was kind of caught up thinking about, the creativity of all the synthesis that you're creating here. I was thinking a lot about temporality and transience and the temporality of transience, and you mentioned nostalgia and all those things, and it seems to also kind of be very bound up with the temporality of the archive, and thinking about the way in which it's this way of capturing the past or something, and yet this fair is particularly about the world of tomorrow and kind of future directed. And I was kind of wondering if there's something to do there in the sense of, how some of these objects and new forms are pushing us to think about transience, less about nostalgia and about a certain past, but rather redirecting us towards the future, towards kind of temporality. Like I've long been a proponent of thinking of the archive not as the past, but as the world of tomorrow, as a kind of something that's about to come again to us through our work and our revisiting of the archive. And because of the particular novels you're talking about today, and Chabon and Cavalier and Clay and comics in 1939, comics seems to be so important here as a great example of one of these emergent new forms, especially the superhero genre, that is perhaps culturally helping orient a whole generation or whole culture towards a new kind of relation to transience. Because Superman, who was himself the man of tomorrow, right? And the Man of Steel, but the Man of Tomorrow for today, because it fits better. And he is kind of teaching everybody, because of his iterative time, kind of stuck in a kind of iterative time that never takes, as Umberto Eco says, like he never takes a step towards death, right? Because he can never show any age or any kind of loss of entropy. So he's always the man of tomorrow. And these stories are kind of, I don't know if there's something particularly interesting about post-45 moment this fair and this kind of convergence of events, but these emergent new forms that might themselves already be teaching us a new way to relate about transience and the future.
Yeah, JC, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that you probably have more sophisticated thoughts about comics in particular and their ability to teach us, I guess, new orientations to time. But there are a couple of things there that I just want to pick up on, which is to say, first of all, I love your idea about the archive as the world's to come again. And it's a very messianic way of looking at the archive. So I really like that. And I'm saying that not in a mocking way, like I really mean that. And it resonates with a lot of how I'm trying to think about history and literary history and the history that these novels are telling. But to go to the point about comics and iterative time and Superman, right, as being this example. And of course, The Escapist is a different kind of superhero, potentially more on the Harry Houdini model, of course, another good Jewish immigrant. But I sort of wonder if, I think often about ephemera and ephemera when they are presented to us, either, you know, like if you want to take a comic as a form of ephemera or an instance in the world of ephemeral art or something like that. Your point about time really resonates for me because I think there's often a strange temporality there, and it's actually a strange temporality that keeps you sort of suspended in the present. You don't know exactly what to do because it's going to vanish. It might be pointing back to the past. When you're talking about reading, of course, that adds another layer of temporality, how you interact with the text, how you move through the time of the text, all of those things. But I actually find that, and I'm not sure if you have thoughts about this and as it relates particularly to comics and the kind of golden age of comics that Chabon himself is trying to diagnose and trying to chronicle as a Jewish form and not just this sort of American mainstream one, but that ephemera reorient us towards time because they have a different, you know, they're supposed to disappear. We're not sure. Are they going to disappear? Are they going to leave a trace? And we find ourselves kind of suspended in recognizing this has come to us only through certain forms of care, but they aren't necessarily visible. And it might sound like I'm just being vague here, but it strikes me as there's the narrative forms of suspense that something like Superman does, which is, you know, actually not very suspenseful in many ways, as you're pointing out via Echo, that it's really about a suspended and sustained present, even as it might be imagining a future or pointing to the past. I don't know, does that make sense with how you think about comics or the archive?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, you know, I don't have an answer to any of these things. I just think it's an interesting convergence that's happening. And comics are absolutely ephemera, you know, and there's also like a great nostalgia for them and some, like, you know, increasing monetary value. But I do think, especially with Chabon, which the novel itself serves as a history of comics. You know, if you read that book, you're also reading a history of American comics at the same time. But you've got this similar kind of turn towards tomorrow rather than the past. In some of the cases there, you know, it's out of necessity, turning away from the horrors of Europe, and, you know, Joe Cavalier escaping with a golem and arriving here in America and all of these kinds of crazy adventures. But also, you know, Houdini as an escape artist. You've got, you know, Orson Welles and Citizen Kane, all these new forms that are emerging and giving everybody new artistic hope towards a kind of new way of doing things in the future. And film is, of course, yet another form that's, I think, peaking here that would match with some of these transient, you know, concerns perhaps. But I don't know. I just think it's a really rich way to kind of think about this moment in terms of materiality, but also in terms of these new forms and the content that they give us, and the overarching lessons that the superhero genre, even though it's like largely repetitive and iterative and crappy, let's face it, it's also got such great hopeful imagination for what the future might be. You know, the Superman is also the champion of the oppressed, all of these other kinds of ways in which there's a pointing to the hope of the future. Yeah.
He gets to escape his boring day job to do, you know, repetitive superhero stuff, which is an irony. But in all
he doesn't want to just be a writer like us.
But the last thing I'll just say that your comment is reminding me of too is actually a sort of side point, but maybe interesting, that of course in different ways. I mean, Chabon is really writing a fan novel, right? That he's a fan of, and he often does, whether it's like, this is my fan music novel, this is my fan comics novel. There's a fanishness, which is central to the fiction. And I mean, I think Dr. O is doing that maybe in a slightly different way, but your point reminds me that ephemera really do also in a particular way, and things like the fair lend themselves to a kind of fanish zeal and a collector's zeal. And I'm not mocking that at all. I mean, when I give talks, it's often the case that people come to me with their boxes of ephemera and are like, look at this, look at that. I love it. I love it. I love it. And there's this kind of love around the forms. Like, you know, we talk about superhero fans, and we've all had students who know every single X-Men and the X-Men's cousin and, you know, all these things, but that there's a kind of early version of this that Chabon and Dr. O are cataloging as well in their novels.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. It's really fascinating. I'm actually really interested in part of the talk when you talk about the failure of the iPad exhibit to digitize the ephemeral. And I'm just wondering, I mean, like, as we sit with these objects in front of us, one of the aspects that's so compelling is that you can kind of feel their ephemerality, like there's a vulnerability to them breaking down, there's like little edges. And in thinking about what you're talking about, the digitization of ephemeral and how, you know, we believe that the digital is something that's going to be preserved forever, but as we know, like, there is digital ephemera, even things like tweets the Library of Congress wanted to, you know, store all these, realize they couldn't. But there's not the same nostalgia for, or perhaps there's not the same nostalgia for digital ephemera. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe the link between the real materiality of ephemeral. It even goes to your point about the care that you have to assume.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping that this group would talk to me about this, but you're tapping right into the like bloodstream of the projects that I'm working on now. And there's an easy, I think you're actually already offering an easy and true answer, right? Which is something gets lost when we can't feel the material because we can't feel the vulnerability. I feel increasingly like, yes, that is true, but there's another piece there. And I don't know that I necessarily have language for this right now, so I apologize if it's messy, but it's true, of course, also, and I think there are people here who work on these things too. People do have nostalgia for earlier forms, right? Whether it's like, oh, now it's meta and I hate it and I liked Facebook, but also who doesn't love to get their hands on a 1980s floppy disk, right? And you might say, well, yeah, but that's a material example. But people say, oh, I really miss Snapchat, and Snapchat got bad when they changed and they started having memories and preserving of the things that you sent. And so I do think the material is really key, but I believe that, or what I'm trying to sort out is whether or not the dynamics of ephemera that I'm interested in. So not the objects themselves, but the dynamics, the fact that things aren't ever truly gone, nor are they ever truly ours, is actually a really good description of how we feel about our digital artifacts, our NFTs, or our, I mean, people are buying tungsten blocks now to touch something, which proves your point, right? But we have all this tension, and it's like a tension that on the one hand, nothing can be deleted. If you've ever tried to delete an embarrassing photo that someone posted of you on Google, like it's never going away. And on the other hand, at the same time, everything feels so immaterial. Nothing can be deleted, yet there's bit rot, you know, and that where we exist so much in that tension right now. It's like a dominant tension, I would say. And that is actually not a new tension. It is the tension of this material thing that you're talking about. And maybe that's too simple a homology, but it's like where I'm stuck right now. But if people have thoughts about how that relates to Biblion, or why Biblion failed, or what it all means to you, I mean, I'd be thrilled to hear them also.
I mean, so I'm just thinking about a lot of questions I have for you, but this follows what you were just saying. So the app, in some ways, right, is just doing what the World's Fair did. It's taking a bunch of things, putting them together in a particular configuration to give people a particular experience, and then it just disappears. You know, like the buildings disassembled. What's left for us is documentation documentation in the form of these archive websites, right? And I'm struck by the fact that like what's left here is documentation. So it's ephemeral, but it's not really ephemeral because it was intended to document something, which is part of the whole bureaucratic culture of the 30s and 40s and everything else as well. So what really is ephemeral is the event and the experience, which I think the iPad and even that video with its hilariously overblown rhetoric is kind of tapping into, right? That's not to say that like they weren't intending to perform your reading.
Yeah, I don't think they were, but yeah.
But I mean, I think that tension that you're describing is very real in the ongoing design. In fact, the history that you've offered of the World's Fair can help illuminate what's happening in those apps, as opposed to being like contrary to it in some way. Or the digital objects. I mean, like a lot of people have talked about, sorry to interrupt you. A lot of people have talked about web archiving. The real difference is that, you know, what I see when I go onto dictionary.com like is different than what you go see when you go onto dictionary.com, because my ads are going to be tailored to the shoes that I was just shopping for, and your ads are going to be tailored to the vacation you're looking at, right? So we can't ever produce an archive of those events anymore, other than through taking web videos that then become documents that are uploaded to something like Internet Archive, right? So there's something that's happening with like the event and its relationship to materiality that's interesting. And not just the document, but the souvenir, right? Because the souvenir, Susan Stewart's talked about this beautifully, right? Like the souvenir is supposed to capture the nostalgia of the event in the like tiny little material object, like the little Trilon Perisphere or whatever. So yeah, it's not really a question. I'm sorry about that, but there's a lot. I'm interested in this kind of tension between the document, the ephemeral, and the souvenir in what you're describing in the event.
There's something like amazing and terrifying in what you said to me, because of course the souvenir, right, as Stuart says, is like we have to have it only for non-repeatable events. You don't need a souvenir if you're going to the DMV. I don't know, that's your driver's license, I guess. But what you said that I find really compelling and slightly terrifying is you said, you know, ephemera are intended to document. And of course, in a way, that's the opposite definition of ephemera and the opposite definition of the one I use, right, which is they're intended to disappear, or they're not meant to stick around. And that's then a strange paradox, because they are literally often documents that are intended to document something that may not be, it's certainly not permanent and therefore potentially non-repeatable. And yet they build in that non-repeatability into themselves. And I think I'm just repeating back to you basically what you said in your question, but I would say, when you're like, the app does the reading that you want it to do. I mean, amazing, actually, in fact, and great, but the app I mean, what you're saying is the app kind of does what the fair does. And that, by my reading, is this kind of excess, this catalog. And it's still the thing that fiction doesn't do, right? Or that fiction can do differently. And that fiction as a document has a very different status than the ephemera as a document. And maybe there's a kind of gap there that I haven't quite thought into properly.
Mitch, do you want to ask your question? I don't know what Laura had her hand up.
She might have had to go.
Okay.
Oh, Laura can go ahead. Is she on? No.
Go ahead, Mitch.
Oh, Laura's here.
I'm here, but my dog is being so loud. I should just ask you later, Sarah. Mitch, you go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I mean, this is just such a great discussion, especially about the necessary tension between ephemera and its preservation. I know I just loved your book, and hearing this discussion is fantastic. I especially liked, I think towards the end, you have this phrase that, you know, to contemporary readers, it seems like loss itself might become obsolete. And I've been thinking about that a lot. And in the way we're talking here about sort of a disappointment of survival, that there's a kind of, you know, like real disappointment that things aren't more ephemeral. And I'm just interested in, when you've had these discussions at book talks or in giving, you know, presentations over the years on this, you know, do you get a real sense? People say like, oh no, like, can you believe X is so ubiquitous? Like a kind of disdain for things that are easy to find, that part of that tension with ephemera is that it must be sort of like a personal achievement, rare, you know, that there's a real kind of sort of anti-replicable bias there, and the ways that appears in people's like affect. Especially I'm curious about that of less so much the fact of it, just that, you know, people's unconscious saying like, you know, this kind of digital media isn't that interesting to me. It's everywhere. It's easily accessible, versus like, oh man, this video game from 1989 on my floppy disk, that's actually really interesting. And then if you told them there's actually 1,000 copies out there and it's $1.10 on eBay, they might actually be very disappointed and lose all interest.
Well, I love your phrase, the disappointment of survival. I mean, that's like a book that someone needs to write now. What kind of reactions do I get? I will say, interestingly, no matter what I talk about, no matter which piece of this research, no matter what I connect it to in the present, people have very strong feelings. And I don't know if that's just academia, but I think that usually people do feel about their own, if they have a investment in ephemera, or if they collect, or if they have things that are precious to them, less do I encounter, I'm so mad to know that many of these still exist, it's not special to me anymore, and more do I encounter, the digital is so off. It is not like, if you digitize this, it has nothing to do with my ephemera, that it becomes a really impoverished copy or an impoverished avatar, and people are really attached to the kind of vulnerability of the material. And maybe that connects, Mitch, to what you're saying, that it can only be special through my heightened sensory awareness that this thing could perish, and I or someone have used forms of care to make it last. That the strong feelings around ephemera do seem to be less about uniqueness or singularity, and more around the effort that it might take to collect, preserve, and curate. And I don't know if that resonates with your experience in the meta ephemeral, like ephemeral fairs. But I would just say that the strong feelings don't seem to be around uniqueness and specialness as much as anti-digitization, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, that's totally fascinating. I'm going to think about that more, and how that connects, especially with like the collecting impulse too.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, and all this conversation makes my brain working so in speed right now. But when you were talking about ephemera or fair in novels, I was thinking about fair on English stage in early modern theater, and then how this like fair appears on the stage as a performance, kind of like bringing theatricality as performance, as well as fair as performance, but performance is performance. And the way you were responding to Whitney and Jake is thinking about ephemera, not related to past or nostalgic, but there's something future orientation in ephemera, and separating materiality from performance. And this very much reminds me Munoz's use of ephemera as evidence, and materiality of ephemera, thinking not the objects and materials as ephemera, but the performance itself, the residue, the effect of the as ephemera, going to structures of feeling to Raymond Williams. And where he's going is queer politics and queer subjects as ephemera in that sense. So I wonder if building the way you are also thinking ephemera in residual or in a similar way, I want to hear maybe the political stakes of this way of thinking in your paper, because you are evoking anti-Semitism, Holocaust, like there's lots of Jewish concerns. I want to hear more about the politics of thinking ephemera this way in relation to materiality and fake.
Yeah, I just want to start with the performance part, because of course, not just, you know, performance is ephemera, and performance studies folks have been theorizing this, as you're saying. But I guess one place I just need to start and offer like one clarification, although you also already articulated that, is that we largely relatively understand performance as ephemeral. We need the souvenir, the material souvenir, to document the thing that we recognized as transient or temporary. And so what I'm interested in, or the things that the authors I'm interested in are interested in, is not that. There's an element of that, of course, as you're saying, like the fair is a performance, but really what the novels that I'm looking at are treating are the material ephemeral. So even though there's a deep connection there, of course, and there is, I think, and that's where I want to talk about politics and evidence, an imbrication, they're not really about performance as such as ephemera, because the tension that they're tracking comes from the object, which is a different kind of paradox when it disappears than a performance that we understand at the outset to be temporary. Okay, that said, the big question about politics and ephemerality. I mean, there are a few different avenues to go down, and I don't want to take too long to do it. So I do think I'm going to maybe call back to some of the things that JC was actually asking about, because really there is something about temporality here in the novels. And I think that as much as, say, something like a novel like Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping becomes about the minor forms of writing that have been classified as ephemera and therefore unmeaningful, and how does Marilynne Robinson want to, you know, resurrect those and chronicle them and make them major and not minor? The political stakes that interest me are in the way that we usually think about something that's temporary as having less political efficacy than something that's permanent. And that might be policy, but it might be like a monument. And we generally think that temporary formations, they're here, they vanish, then what? What do you do? What does it mean? What can it leave? What's the residual? What's the trace? And the novels that I'm looking at are really committed, quite frankly, I think, to showing that when you have an interaction, I mean, it sounds silly, when you have an interaction with ephemera, but when there's a kind of orientation toward ephemerality, towards transience, it's not grasping, it's not permanent, that has really important consequences. So in terms of like hard examples, you know, that can be about reorganizing urban space. That there might be a temporary shrine or a temporary roadside memorial, and it's going to block traffic and it's going to form kind of new communities, and then they're gone. And what does that mean? And I think there's a tendency to say like, well, that was a kind of flash in the pan and it doesn't have that much political import. But like Munoz talking about the trace and how important that is, I think these novelists are actually interested in what forms of community and new spaces and new visibility that orientation makes possible.
Oh, go ahead.
Where, like, the glamorous, well-lit lives that people on Zoom are leading with their rambunctious dogs seems like so much more appealing than
I know.
like, the degraded copy that we're experiencing here.
It's the infoscape, look away.
But I guess I'm wondering what happens if you add, Sarah, Richard Powers's Prisoner's Dilemma to the mix of World's Fair novels that you're considering. Here I'm sort of asking on the heels of Comet's question, because there's, you know, as you know, a novel that connects the 39 World's Fair to the Trinity test, to the body as an archive of radiation, to the internment of Japanese Americans, although through a kind of counterfactual narrative in which they become employees of Disney and animators. And so it seems like that novel is pointing in a really different direction as regards archives, ephemerality, bodies. I think, but I don't know what you're reading of it.
I mean, it is and it isn't, right? I think so. It's been a while since I've read it, but it's the very first chapter. It's early in the novel that we get the fair, and then we diverge into all the, it sort of spins out from there. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
I mean, I think you're sort of ricocheting back and forth between different
Different times. I think it's in the, okay. You know, I don't write about that novel, but I do think when you say, when we talk, you know, you talk about the things that it relates to, it actually brings me right back to Liliana's point, right? Which is that the fair in fiction is always deeply connected to, or not always, I shouldn't say that, of course, but in most of the novels I can think of, with a couple exceptions, the 39 World's Fair is deeply connected to war and to the mutilation of bodies. And even if Powers, I think what you're pointing to is Powers is not using the nostalgic mode that Chabon and Doctorow are. And so that's a kind of key difference in the affect. But the fact that the link is still so much about that really does to me feel still like the fictional foil to what we see in the archive. Although I guess then it you know, brings us back a little bit to whether or not the Biblion app, how much they're trying to link it to war. You could see a little bit in that video that they are talking about, you know, wartime this. But, you know, the truth is that to answer your question, you know, I don't have a reading of the Powers novel, except to say that it fits with, if not the affective mode, it still fits with the historical mode, I think.
Okay, let's have.
I think Marcy.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
go ahead.
Marcy, why don't you ask our final question?
Wow, no pressure. Thank you so much for this. There's so much to think about in your talk today and all your work. And I don't mean this at all as like a flip question or an unfair question, but what if you changed your terms from ephemera, which is really, you know, an academic and an archival term, and one that really people who value our ephemera wouldn't use for those objects, right? But to commodity. And what if you change your theorist from Freud to Marx, which is to say, right, it bubbled up a lot in a lot of ways, like material, the materiality and material conditions, and also commodification in your talk, especially in the Einstein quote in the capsule, right? But I was also thinking too about the radical strain of Jewish thought, especially in the 20th century and activism, right? That's very Marxist. And so, and this is really a selfish question too, out of my own time at UD, thinking about especially, yeah, the very classed nature of material culture studies and how often that classed nature and really a kind of Marxist framework for thinking about these things and our engagements with these things is the one that's used the least often. So yeah, that's, I think, the simplest way I can kind of ask that. Where's Marxism?
That's a great question. And it's interesting to me that you think it's the least used. I totally agree with you and take what you're saying about how in a very particular type of, is this off the record? Are we recording? No, but the kind of UD based material culture that it might not be so frequently used. But part of why, one thing that I became really interested in around ephemera when I was, you know, doing that work and thinking about that term was because there had been a very big Marxist focus in material culture studies prior to the, you know, moment that I was getting trained in this, and that people were really focused on production and consumption in a Marxist way, in the labor that went into things, and how that shapes exchange and how that shapes class relations as well. And it felt to me that that focus, that really strong focus on production, while it makes great sense and is important work to do, it was hard to make that speak to disappearance and vanishing. And of course, it's intimately related. You know, why do we throw certain things away, and who throws what away, and when do people steward certain types of objects and not others? But so that's one answer, to just say that Marxism for me, as important as it is, always to my work, and actually the place that I was before or earlier prior to this project in a way with my research, it didn't have the answers that I was looking for in terms of why transience in literature made us feel a certain way. And I think just to think about commodity versus ephemera, these are commodities, right? And that's a very banal thing to say, but they're a special class of commodities. And I suppose my immediate question becomes, and does that make them, do they have higher use value or higher you know, exchange value? Do they become more desirable because they're transient? And people have sort of pointed to certain instances where X or Y becomes more valuable because it's transient, because it's vanishing, because it's rare. But that, you know, one of the terms that I didn't bring up in the talk today that comes from Benjamin is exhibition value. And he's thinking of another type of value that commodities have, which isn't captured by use or exchange. And I think exhibition value, I mean, especially when you're talking about a fair, it's intimately connected to the commodity regime that these novels are chronicling, but it's another dimension that isn't just particularly about the classed nature of objects.
Okay, I think we
So much
should stop there because we've made you go for a long time already. So thank you very much for.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.